Buffalo. Ready, fire, aim.
All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to open up this meeting, the Justice Reinvestment Grant Review Committee. So what we're going to do today is we'll take a little time to get oriented to where we are in the process. Mike's going to share with us some changes that we've made in what is called now the second draft rules. There's copies available over there. Then we're going to talk about what was the assignment from last committee, which is members of the committee taking the first draft rules back to their respective communities, having them look over those draft rules and bring back comments and thoughts about those rules. So we'll have you all report out. Then we'll have a discussion of RCT, random controlled trials, and then we'll be done. So we'll start out by just some quick introduction. So, Commissioner?
I'm Jim Bernard, Clackamas County Commissioner.
I'm Kiki Park-Rose, Director of Klamath County Community Corrections and represent OACCD.
Floyd Przonski, State Senator, District 4, includes parts of Lane Douglas County, also Chair Judiciary, Senate side.
Representative Jennifer Williamson, representing the west side of Portland.
Mike Schmidt, Criminal Justice Commission, staffing this committee.
Alex Gardner, Lane County DA.
Under Sheriff Tim Moore, here in place of Sheriff Dan State.
Excellent. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. I blame Mike for doing this in August. I had to get it in there. All right, Mike, walk us through what's changed in our second draft rules.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee and everyone here assembled. Last time before this committee, I presented the first draft of the rules, which I think were dated May 20th or so. Since then, the chair convened another small work group of the same work group that got together the first time to get something on paper for this committee to consider. We came back and looked at, which was essentially a placeholder, the victim's 10% allocation question. So what you have in front of you, the draft that is now dated 7/18, really is the same thing that you had before with amendments starting on page 5. So I'll just start at page 5 and kind of talk to you about what it is that we think this accomplishes. So on page 5, starting with section 213 0600090, labeled grant applications, what this section sets out is that the 10% of the entire pot that by statute is going to be allocated to nonprofit community-based service providers, that 10% pot would actually be brought back from the entire grant fund. So if, for example, the grant fund was $66 million in the next biennium, $6.6 million would be held back for this specific nonprofit community-based victim services organizations. The CJC would then administer that grant pot in a way that's similar. It would be a competitive grant-based application system. So these community-based service providers would write applications to the CJC listing what they would do with the money and what criteria it is that they would use to, we would determine whether or not they should receive it. On the next page, the grant application review criteria. In there, we have currently 3 things listed for criteria, which is demonstrated need for the proposed services in the community, a geographic distribution of awardees. The thought was that the commission would want to make the awards as geographically dispersed as possible to make sure everybody in the state gets coverage from this grant pool. And then the kind of the catch-all, which is any other criteria that the commission chooses to include in the solicitation. So right now, that was our thought process of this small group that got together and wrote this. To advise the Criminal Justice Commission on whether or not and how to evaluate these applications, these rules also create a crime victim services expert advisory panel. So the commission would appoint The Crime Victim Services Expert Advisory Panel, consisting of 7 to 9 members, who are demonstrated, who would be put forward as people who have this kind of experience to be able to evaluate applications. And that panel would assist the CJC, the commissioners of the CJC, in awarding grants. So essentially, it would pull back 10% of the total grant allocation, and then there'd be a competitive grant process, the criteria of which would be geographic distribution and demonstrated need in the community. And there'd be an expert advisory panel of victims, service providers who would help advise the CJC in evaluating the applications. So that's what these sections aim to do. And other than that, I'm happy to answer any other questions that I can, but the rest of the rules remain as they were in the previous draft.
Thanks, Mike. I think one important part of this is the catch-all under the grant review criteria. We spent a couple of hours putting together what kind of criteria we would want to see in these grants, and what a successful grant looks like and all of that, and then decided that really should not be in our rules. That should be, with the advisory panel, understanding where, working through those with the CJC, and that this was not the appropriate place to necessarily spell all of that out. And so that's why we included a catch-all. And we wanted to have the experts in the room making sure that we were comparing grant applications in the right way to get diverse coverage and diverse programs, including regional programs and community-based programs and the variety of services that we hope to fund with this. So, any questions? Any questions from the audience? All right. Well, thank you. Again, if you could take this back, circulate it with your constituencies and see if there's any issue or concern, and let Mike know, that would be great. All right, so Mr. Prinz, come on down. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Grant Review Committee. For the record, I'm Craig Prinz. I'm the Director of the Criminal Justice Commission. I wanted to, we've been talking with our counsel at DOJ, because as you know, you are basically have an advisory capacity, and then the CJC will put these, we're still in kind of the, we're before draft rules even right now with what we've got. This is just, thankfully, you all putting on paper with staff a concept or a framework for some rules for these grants, and then we'll move into the rulemaking process. And so as a part of working through that with the Department of Justice, we talked about having a rulemaking advisory committee. A rulemaking advisory committee, for those of you who are not used to promulgating state administrative rules, is a way really to get elicit response about the financial or fiscal impact of rulemaking. Frankly, it's more for, you can tell from the language of it, it's more for regulatory rules, like for, say, agriculture, if we were going to regulate hazelnut growers in some way, we would want to get an impact about the impact from small business. But in our case, in talking with Ms. Amesbury, she thought it was a good idea to ask this body to serve as our advisory committee. And so what I would like to do is ask you to do that. And then what we're looking at is recommendations as to whether these rules will have a fiscal impact, and what extent that impact will be, and whether the rules will have specifically a significant impact on small business. And so I wanted to give you the questions that Ms. Amesbury would really like to have you be the ones to respond initially from this. Do you think what do you think of the following questions and impacts on small business? And then I think this is something we can address later, so that the folks that are we're streaming today, and then folks in the audience, if they have comment. I think this is a good thing we want to make sure we have a sense of.
Well, Greg, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as a committee. This is giving us a role that is essentially required by statute.
Yeah.
So Craig is making sure that we are checking some statutory boxes by giving this committee this designation.
Correct. It doesn't feel like a fit for these rules because we're giving grants to counties. So you're going to hear the questions are going to be like, what are the impacts to small business? But Ms. Amesbury thought it would be better to fulfill the statute on this, because if we didn't, the remedy for that would be kind of going back to zero and starting the whole rulemaking process over again. So rather than do that, I wanted to ask you some questions that you may feel like there's not really much nexus with these type of rules. So, Ms. Chair, if I can do that, I think it'll make sense what these are intended for, and then I really want you to think about how it might be germane for these rules.
And we don't need to answer these questions.
No, correct.
Right now. Okay, just want to make sure.
But I would, if you have any responses, I would like to get them on the record at this time, and then we can revisit this at another meeting, and then we will have, I don't know if Michael put out a revised timeline. Maybe I should go through this real quickly. Did the committee have that?
None.
We don't.
Okay. So let me do this so that everyone understands where we are in kind of the rulemaking process. So, kind of the hallmark of Oregon's rulemaking process is plenty of notice for public comment. And that's going to be the case for these rules. So what we would like to see is today we're just getting feedback on what's been put on paper, hearing from you all, your associations, and certainly folks here that would like to speak to that. And then you're going to serve as the advisory committee that will be really an extension of the rulemaking that the Criminal Justice Commission will do. Later this month, or in September, the CJC, the 7 commissioners of the CJC who are appointed by the governor, and then Senator Przansky and Representative Olson are ex officio members. They will, later this month or in September will be the first time the CJC will consider what you've done, your work product, consider anything that comes from this meeting, from the advisory committee meeting, and that's when we will start to decide actual draft rules. And those will be the draft rules that we will start into the administrative rule process. We will have a notice of proposed rulemaking that will we'd like to get that done in the middle of September. We will send notice out to interested parties, and then the CJC is really thinking we would like to do some listening tours. So we would have staff go down, say, to Southern Oregon, go to Central or Eastern Oregon, and have a time for public comment on the draft rules. Again, we want to get as much information about what people think of these, how it will impact different regions, how it will impact different counties to have, these rules in place for the justice reinvestment process. Ms. Amesbury right now is looking at the last day for public comment to be in mid-November, November 15th. That would then allow us, then we would have time to review all the public comment, review and consider any proposed rules, and then Ms. Amesbury would be able to, in early December, prepare permanent rules. We would file those, and then we would have a meeting to adopt those with the goal of having permanent rules in place before the legislature starts, so that we would have the rules in place by January 2015. And then, of course, the legislative process will figure out how much money's going to those rules, what's happening. So that's where we are in the big picture. That's a lot of information. I hope that context helps rather than confuses. Do you have any questions about that, kind of where we are to this point?
Craig, can we get copies of that timeline?
Yep.
Yeah.
And the committee will remember that we were kind of pushing this aggressive timeline to make sure that the Ways and Means process lined up with the rules as we decided, so we weren't having parallel discussions about money and all of that. So we were intent on making sure that we got the rules in place before the legislative process.
Right, and so that's the goal, and that's why we're, at this point, we're asking you to serve as the advisory committee for the CJC in this rulemaking process. I will say I did get, Michael mentioned $66 million. That was the amount of cost avoidance that the Department of Corrections estimated we would see when we did the 3194 estimates. I did put that into our agency request budget. I submitted that last week. So we have started the formal process of getting this into a policy option package of the CJC that would then fund this grant program. The grant, and as Michael said, after the permanent rules are in effect, which would be in January of 2015, your role will shift from a rulemaking advisory committee to then an expert panel that will give the CJC a recommendation as to whether or not to fund individual county grants. So does that make sense? I know it's August. I think we could all do with a, what are we doing again? So that's where we are in the process. So
Hold on one second,
yeah,
Craig.
absolutely.
Alex.
Thank you. So wasn't there additional money that was potentially in play that was savings from foregone prison construction costs?
Madam Chair and Mr. Gardner, that's a great question. I think the main thing, and I walked through with Mr. Underhill, and I'm going to walk through with him again for the ODAA. It's the question of how do you calculate the construction cost for Junction City? Do you try to, capture the whole construction cost or a part of that? Mr. Allen from the Department of Corrections sat down with Mr. Underhill and myself and worked through it. There's many ways you could try to calculate the avoided cost, and I'm going to try to keep, and you're welcome to those meetings, and I can overview that for the committee. But we feel that this would be capturing the full cost for this biennium, but we would not be taking the full cost of a prison. We would basically be doing the debt service that would be due this in the next biennium. Does that make sense? Many ways to try to capture the total cost avoidance, and we're just doing one way that we think is rational. But I'm making sure that I'm working with folks from the association, the folks who negotiated this, to make sure it's rational to them. And so far, I think it seems rational to them as well.
Hold on a second.
Okay.
And so, if I can,
Do you want Craig to hold that?
Is that Mr. Sherman?
No.
Okay.
No, we're just opening the conference
Okay.
line.
So for those if you have any questions about the
Welcome
proposed
to AT&T
timeline
teleconference
for the
service.
committee or
Please
myself,
enter your access code.
Madam
I'll
Chair, do we have
stop.
to restart over?
There
No.
are 2 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Hi, who's on the line?
Stuart Roberts, representing the Oregon Association of
Okay.
Chiefs of Police.
Hi, Chief. So
I thought she said 2 people on the line, but one of us is, okay, just checking. All right, go ahead.
So, just to wrap up, so everyone I think in the audience and the committee has the rulemaking, the sample timeline we called it. Angie Albee is here. She's the rulemaking coordinator for the Criminal Justice Commission. So we will, if you have any questions, contact Angie or myself, and we'll make sure and keep everyone in the loop on how we're going to do these rules. So for your service as the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, here's the questions that would love to have you think about, and then again, put anything on the record. Really, will these rules have a fiscal impact? And the first question would be focusing on for state agencies, for local governments, businesses, and specifically small business. Will these have a fiscal impact? Again, I looked at, usually they're thinking of a negative fiscal impact. We're looking at making grants or hoping for $66 million to counties. But I think the question remains, will the rules have a fiscal impact?
Craig,
Yeah.
I have a question on
Yeah.
that. Administration of the grants at the county level. Does that count as a fiscal impact? If it's not included in the grant application, then there in fact would be a fiscal impact to a county.
Yeah, that's a great question, Madam Chair and members of the committee. We would run this just like we run our drug court grants. So we would have a fiscal relationship. We will have a contract with one lead agency in the county. As you remember, the LIPSIC approves the grant application. We would make that clear in it, and we're looking at having quarterly reporting to the CJC. So I think we have drug court grants in 28 of the 36 counties. We would do it exactly like that. It's an online reporting that we try to utilize. And so there would be some impact to the administrator, the lead fiscal or the financial fiduciary agency. And, we haven't talked about this, and I don't think it's in the rules, but it's typical to have, if that's a cost that can be borne with the grant, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we've done that in the past. So
Okay.
Wanted to make that clear.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can you all think, it's kind of a weird question. Do you think there'll be a fiscal impact of these grants other than money coming in?
Yeah, I think so. I think it'd be disingenuous not to, yes, there's a fiscal impact to counties, there's a fiscal impact to the state, fiscal impact to DOC. I don't know how specific the limitation is around small business.
Well, I think it'd be good, if I can, just put your thoughts on the record so we have them would be the best thing, I think, and especially from your perspective with the sheriff's office in Multnomah.
My perspective is a clear yes, fiscal impact, unless there's a limitation that puts the boundaries around small business fiscal impact, and then I doubt if there's much of that.
And then the question really is, Craig, how much of the administrative costs will be borne in the actual grant application, right? So
yeah, I don't think we put
it's offset.
We haven't put a limitation on that. For example, when we administer the Byrne grant for the state, we can use up to 10% of the grant for administration. We could put something into the rule like that. So for administering the grant, there's a certain percentage. I think that would be wise to make sure that the county doesn't have can take that out of the grant. We try to make the administration of the grant as, we try to make it streamlined as possible, but we want to do enough. We want to be able to report back, obviously, on what's happening. We want to be able to have, in the application, how many people you're going to serve, what type of things you're going to be doing, so that we can report back to the legislature. So I think it's very fair to have an administrative a percentage, and maybe that's something we should think about making clear in the rules.
My only concern with that is that it wouldn't limit grant applications for smaller counties that will take necessarily a bigger administrative cost, because they may be hiring a whole person to do something that in another county there would be infrastructure for. And so I think we may see in some of these grants what would be considered a significant administrative cost, but because of the size of the county or the community being served or whatever, I want to make sure we don't limit the kinds of applications we could get. And this includes the victim services piece, because if we're serving a smaller community and you need a 24-hour hotline, it needs to be open 24 hours. You've got to have somebody there answering the phone for 24 hours. And so the administration of that grant in a smaller county may be different than where there's already built up infrastructure. So I want to make sure that's on the record, that that's not my intent, is to have it be limited so that we have the most flexibility.
That's great. And then the follow-up question, will there be an impact? I appreciate the Undersheriff's comments. Any way to try to estimate what the extent of that impact would be? Because then I think the next question is, what could we do to mitigate that? And I think we're getting to this issue of allowing some percentage of the grant to be used to alleviate or mitigate the cost of administering the grant. So, Tim, any way to, on your thoughts of, like, let's say there's a for-profit business or a nonprofit business in Multnomah County that you want to engage, their services, or Scott Taylor wants to engage their services for the community-based programs. Any way to try to think about what the extent of that impact would be?
I can't think of a way to capture it. I think it's going to be very different for a community nonprofit than it is a government providing the same services.
Right. Alex, how about maybe for someone like, say, for sponsors, for example, or one like that, we could look at how in our drug court grants or our reentry grants, how we've handled that impact up to this point. But do you have any comment, just for the record, on how the extent of the impact on, say, a for-profit or nonprofit under these grants?
Yeah, as I understand, the purpose of the inquiry is to look really at potential adverse impact.
Correct, adverse.
Right, and so we have a net positive flow of money coming into the community.
Correct.
That's going to small businesses, and certainly most of the larger counties already administer lots of grants, and it's not inexpensive, it's not insignificant. But it is a small part of the total project cost, and so the county and the businesses are net money ahead.
Right.
So if there's $66 million being distributed to Oregon's counties, I'd be surprised if it was more than $6 or $7 million in administrative cost, and my guess is it's probably a lot less than that certainly for the big 5 counties that already have that infrastructure in place. I bet it's less than 6%.
Okay. And then, just as I'm fleshing this out for the record, specific to small business, and this is specific not for nonprofits, but the rules and the statute really look to a significant adverse impact on small business. And these are businesses formed for the purpose of making profit, independently owned and operated, and that have 50 or fewer employees. Do you see any of these contracts going to a for-profit business, for-profit small business? Do you see an impact in that area from your experience with, Ms. Parker Rose? If that, with administering community corrections, do you make any or foresee using any grants for that type of business?
I think there's some agencies, community corrections agencies across the state that do contract with for-profit places to provide some sort of service, whether it's a mental health or employment service. Generally, I think they're nonprofit, but I think there's some for-profits, especially in the smaller areas. There might just be one person or agency that does that. But I don't know that would be a negative fiscal impact.
Yeah, an adverse impact, yeah.
Right.
So that's, maybe to wrap it up, I think the last question is, if there is an impact, on, state agency, local government, business, small business specifically, the small business, what could you recommend as far as mitigating it, mitigating that cost of compliance? And I think we've already maybe come to it, is we want to make it clear in the rules that portion of the grant can be used to defray the cost of administering the grant. Does that sound like a reasonable way to mitigate that?
I like the frame of the significant adverse impact. I don't think we go anywhere close to that. There's an impact, but it's not significant, and it's clearly not adverse. It's going to be, I like the analogy of net money ahead for a local community.
Yeah, and I like the flexibility of that language, frankly, Craig, because like I said, until we see these applications, I want to make sure we're not inadvertently limiting the kinds of things we can be funding.
Yeah.
Because we just don't know necessarily what it's going to look like, especially in the victim services arena.
That's good. So to wrap up, I think that's the type of thing that we'll get this record to the commission. Kiki is on the commission and this committee, so Kiki, you can help me relay what we talked about. Senator Przansky is as well. So Senator Przansky as well, and
You got that?
got you too.
Yeah, you
And
got
so,
those notes?
and then what we want to specifically looks like in the rules is to make sure, again, it doesn't seem like this would have a significant adverse impact on small for-profit businesses. But if we saw any kind of place where it would be, how can we mitigate that? Could we exempt them from some type of rule requirements and things like that? But I think, as you can see from the record we're making, I think these rules and statutes are really made for where there's a regulatory impact. We wanted to make sure, as a state, that there's not an unintended consequence or unintended impact to small business. And so, thank you for your patience on developing that record. I know Ms. Amesbury would be pleased with me, and we can move on with the rest of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so now is the time where members of the committee, I would like folks to comment on the rules and what what your various constituencies had as far as feedback. I think what the plan is going to be is that we will get, or you will get, to Mike, comments in writing. If you orally report out today and don't have anything in writing, if you could summarize that even in an email to Mike, he can compile all of that feedback and he'll distribute it to the rest of us so that we have a little bit of time to think about various comments and changes, additions that folks on this committee would like to see made in the rules. And I think part of the question for this committee will be what can be worked out in this pre-rule promulgation situation, as opposed to what really is public comment for the CJC when they're promulgating the rules. So I'd just like in this committee to make a record to have you all report out, and then Mike, like I said, Mike will distribute it, and at the next meeting we'll address where we can go with the kinds of comments that we have. And in addition, the comments to the new victim services language. So if that sounds okay with folks, then how about we start to my left, Commissioner? We can start to my right if you want.
It's been so long since we've had a meeting and talked about this stuff. I'm not sure I can just say a whole lot except like we talked about before, it is new money. The biggest fear that I have about any time you get new money is that you build up a program and then somebody sweeps it away. And so there has to be a lot of care in making sure that the investments that we make are sustainable. I mean, I hear it all the time on the commission. Should we invest in this program or that program, and where's money going to be in the future? So, generally speaking, I think that the first draft of the rules were, people found them acceptable and reasonable and things that they would be willing to work with. Chris could probably say more since he's our expert as far as I'm concerned, but additional money is something that we're all looking forward to, and that we're committed to making sure that we continue on this path and that money continues to come to us. I'd say that for smaller counties, you know, any percentage may be a challenge because we don't know what the grant size is. So 10% of what
Right.
isn't going to necessarily fund the personnel that it takes to get the money. So I hope that we're considering, you know, smaller counties partnering to apply for the grant. I mean, it's very similar to Community Corrections Commission, and actually I'm on the Community Corrections Commission also. So we look at grants, we evaluate that, and then we ask people to partner, and they have to show a program that you know, is evidence-based and has proven to be successful, or they have to adapt the program to make sure that it does meet those standards. Other than that, I would say AOC hasn't had a chance to meet yet, so we're meeting next week to talk further, and I'll bring back the second draft for review of the Public Safety Committee.
Great, thank you. So if AOC wants to submit formal comments, you can get them to Mike, and then he can distribute them.
Great.
Excellent.
I just have a couple of comments, and the association met about a month ago and reviewed the rules. We met also and asked just a few questions. For example, on page 2 of the 7, we wanted to confirm that there would just be one application per local public safety coordinating council, so that there wasn't more than one application coming in. And so I don't know if we want to clearly articulate in the rule that only one application from the local public safety coordinating council would be accepted. There are some jurisdictions where the lip sync doesn't meet that often, and there may not be a lot of coordination, and so that was one of the comments that we had. Another comment that we had was what will be the Board of County Commissioners' role in this, because lip sync is an appointed board by the Board of County Commissioners, and so it seems odd that lip sync would be submitting the application without BOCC being involved at some point. So that may be something, Commissioner Bernard, that AOC talks about. The next thing that we had questions about or wanted to also look at was the UCR requirement. We believe that's already in ORS, and that's on page 3. And I don't know if we want to review that further, but the UCR requirement is something that's already a requirement, so it seems like it's an additional requirement for something that may be repetitive. And then the second part of that is the piece about the operation of the county jail and the capacity. This does not appear to be specific to just 3194 offenders, and so we want to know, should there be something where we're just capturing 3194 offenders in this population, since that's what we're talking about, or do we want to really look at the overall jail population in each county? We also thought it would be important maybe to add language that stated something to the effect of identifying whether the arrest, pretrial charging, conviction, and/or incarceration practices in each county promote an evidence-based strategy and reduce the overall prison population. Pretrial is not mentioned in any of this, but there are some counties that are utilizing 3194 funds for pretrial. So the arrest, pretrial, charging, and conviction may be something that we want to look at as part of the overall approach, especially when we look at what the state data tells us now, and that is the first prison commitments are high. And so maybe we could take a look at what that actually means, and if there's some pretrial functions that we could become involved in that could maybe prohibit folks from actually entering into the prison system. Under 213-060-0070, it mentions the commission may amend a grant award under this rule. We just questioned how that grant rule could be amended. So that might be something that we may want to look at for further discussion.
When I think to comment on that piece, I think the intent was if there was, there are various levels of sophistication and experience with submitting grants. And so we wanted to make sure that once a grant was submitted, if there was something that was problematic in the way it was written or whatever, that CJC staff could call those folks and say, you know, this is what I think you're trying to say, and I don't want you to be precluded from getting a grant because you've already submitted it, and if it was phrased differently or if you added this piece or whatever, then you would be eligible. So that's the intent of that language.
Okay. Again, we just don't want to, again, prohibit anyone from being successful in a grant application
Right.
because they don't have the expertise.
Absolutely, and so that, yeah, that's the spirit of that. If we need to tighten the language, I'm fine with that. I just want to make sure that we can have a more fluid conversation with a county around what it looks like to be successful in this process.
Okay, that's great. And the next piece was really more about the victim information, but it appears from what was changed today that that's kind of been addressed. So those were the Community Corrections Director's thoughts at this point.
Excellent, thank you. Any questions? All right, do you have any comments, sir?
Madam Chair, I'm allowing for the certified smart people on our little committee here to advise us, since they're the ones that are on the ground in the field doing the application, and we'll be here to serve and make sure they get what they need to hopefully facilitate this in a positive way. So no, thank you at this time.
Just wanted to make sure you had the opportunity.
Thank you.
Mr. Gardner.
Madam Chair, Senator Przanski just exempted me from the process by limiting it to in the interest of sort of condensing this, there's a letter that DA Foote wrote to the committee members on July 22nd, and I don't know if y'all have that handy, but starting with the second to last paragraph first, because I think that's one paragraph that I have to be very careful because I'm not on the board of the ODAA, and I really don't speak for the ODAA, and I'm error-prone enough to screw this up. So, but my sense is that most of the members of the ODAA who were involved in this process believe that the agreement was this money for victims was going to be reserved for nonprofits. So because of that, I don't think the ODAA can be on board with that paragraph that begins with finally, that asks for some of that to be, that funding under 213-060-0040 to be sent to DA's offices, although we could really use some help, but that's not part of this money. He makes some other proposals that I'll just incorporate by this reference and then say that I think I can distill a few of the ideas. The first is that the sense on the part of the ODAA is that this money was reserved to do something different, not to just supplant funding that's eroded over time, and that it was to all be vigorously tested via randomized control trials or the best science available. That's a really critical component for the ODAA. So that and a repeating theme, anywhere there are descriptions of how the grant proposals ought to be structured, there will always be an expectation that really good science, not blurred meta-analysis type science, be included. There's another very significant general idea, and that is that our sense is that 3194 isn't designed to reduce prison population. If we do this correctly and we put in good programs, they'll have the desired effect, and the net result will be reduction of prison population. Right. And if we don't put in programs that have that effect, there's going to be no money to fund this. But that's different from saying that our primary objective is reducing prison population, and so that's why DA Foote is asked to rework some of that language. I hope that makes sense.
It does.
And I think that's it. I don't, the version that I shared with the members of, some of the members of the PSCC who probably didn't have adequate time to provide feedback was the May version, and so I'll recycle this and have more to report next time, or I'll do it in writing.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Undersheriff?
I'm not sure if this went out to OSSA for comment, but I will follow up on that this coming week. And just from my read of it, my concerns surround the smaller counties' ability to participate in this. I think if we put a program in place that fits perfectly in the metro area counties, it precludes a lot of counties just in the terms of administrative overhead to make the program work. I'm really concerned with randomized control trials when we get to small counties that may just not make a lot of sense. So my personal read of the rules from a career in sheriff's offices is what works for Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington, Marion, Lane to some extent may not work east of the mountains or on the coast. So I'll collect that input from different people in OSSA and get it back. But I think that's something I'd like to keep our eye on.
Thank you for that. That is absolutely a concern, and a concern of mine to make sure that these rules are flexible enough that small counties working together, we have the ability within these rules to grant money to programs that may not make any sense in the metro region, right? So making sure that this is flexible enough language that we don't limit the kinds of programs that we can fund so that we can take it on a case-by-case basis. So I share your concern, and if there's language that needs to be changed to make sure we get at that, I think that's a goal of this committee. Chief, you're on the phone.
Yes, Madam Chair, first I want to say I appreciate the concern for rural counties and agencies that exist out here to the east of the mountains. I disseminated the rules to the members of the Oregon Chiefs Association and didn't receive a lot of feedback, which is not real surprising considering that most prosecutorial decisions, judicial processes, supervision, and incarceration occur at the county or state level. However, the comments I did receive, one was pertinent on page 1. Let's see, it's under definitions, subsection C. The request was to remove evidence-based and just start with programs with the belief that there may be some innovation that occurs that allows opportunity and really allows the committee in and of itself to make the determination of whether or not they believe it's potentially viable based on the justification provided. The comment that I received thought that maybe the evidence base may be too limited in terms of really allowing people to explore opportunities that are tailored to their community, their offender populations, their problems, and such and the like. So that was basically the only thing that I received in response from municipal chiefs. And again, I'll reiterate that ours is more of a partnership with most of the functions and responsibilities of the state or the county. So I'm not overly surprised by the lack of feedback. I did receive several comments that the rules appeared appropriate for what was intended.
Great, thank you for that. So is there anyone in the audience that has any feedback on the rules that they'd like to get on the record? So I know there's a lot of stakeholders in the room, and I want to make sure that we're taking into account stakeholders who may not serve on this committee. Any takers? All right. So next steps. Circulate to your associations if that has not yet occurred and get those comments to Mike. I would encourage folks in the room to do the same thing. If you have feedback on the, let's agree, the second set of draft rules with the victim's language, please get that to Mike so that he can distribute it to us. And we can start the process of, and I'm not sure how we're going to do this yet. If you've got thoughts, Mike, that would be great, on incorporating comments around things we can all agree on. Hello?
Hello, this is Lawrence Sherman calling in.
Oh, right. 1 second, Mr. Sherman, and then we'll be ready to go. So if,
Thank you very much.
if when we get comments back, we can move forward from there on what is an early public comment and what is something that in this phase of the process we can incorporate into the language. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think for me, Madam Chair, the next step will be to hopefully members of this committee and members in the public who are interested and want to get me comments, I can get those out to this committee. Hopefully I get those by the end of this week, or as soon as your organization is able to meet to get those, get it to me as soon as possible. I'll bring them all, put them all together, get them back out so that we can, looking at the timeline that Mr. Prinz distributed to the committee, we're really shooting for that mid-September kind of launch date for the commissioners on the CJC to start the formal rule process. So hopefully if I can get all of your comments back to you all to look at them with maybe some ideas on specifically how we should amend the rules that we have right now on paper, things that should be added or crossed out. And then we can have one more meeting before that mid-September time to get back together. I'll have another version distributed for everyone to look at, and then we finalize that recommendation to the commissioners.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our on-the-phone guest, or?
You good with that?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking.
No, are we ready? Are we going to that now?
Yep, we're moving on to the discussion of random controlled trials. And on the phone, we have Dr. Lawrence Sherman, and DA Gardner is going to do a quick introduction.
Thank you for Madam Chair, and thank you, Professor Sherman, for joining us this afternoon. Professor Lawrence Sherman is director of the Institute of Criminology of the University of Cambridge, where he has served as the Wolfson Professor of Criminology since 2007. He's director of both the Jerry Lee Center of Experimental Criminology and the Cambridge Police Executive Program, which offers postgraduate degrees and non-degree courses on evidence-based policing to police leaders and crime analysts from around the world. He has a tremendous resume, and I understand from speaking this afternoon with Craig Prinz that he deserves much of the credit, if not most of the credit, for the early Clinton administration COPS grants. He's been a leader in criminology and law enforcement for many, many years, and we're very fortunate to have him with us this afternoon. And with that, Professor, please lead us.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what a hard-headed business principle it is to protect the taxpayers' money by not spending on programs that don't have a demonstrated profit from the standpoint of an investment by the taxpayer. And the problem with preventing homicides and preventing child abuse and lots of these other things that we have to do in the public sector is that the notion of profit doesn't translate very easily into a program-by-program comparison. So even if you talk about a stock return on investment with the stock price rising, or a dividend as a way of thinking about it, you have a portfolio of programs. It's not really easy to compare one program to another in terms of how much return on investment you're getting for the same amount of money. And a lot of what we're doing in the British policing context right now with what's called the College of Policing, which is a kind of branch of the equivalent of the U.S. Department of Justice. It has 15 directors. I'm one of them, and we're trying to develop a way of costing the investment in police in relation to the amount of crime that police can prevent doing different things. And this is actually a very exciting prospect for a place that's cutting the police budget by 20% to try to deal with the national deficits and lots of other things. So how do we get to profit in the public sector? It's the same for education and for health, really, as it is for policing or criminal justice ventures generally. And the answer that I've been working on now for over 30 years, since my first experiment in relation to domestic violence, is to use the randomized controlled trial. It's the only way we get something that is approximately like a profit and loss statement. It's the thing you need for a clear cost-benefit analysis. You can get close to it with other kinds of research designs, but unless you have a strong evaluation in relation to the costs invested, and some measure of the benefit, and I want to come back to that at the end of my remarks, you're really throwing money into the dark. So what is it that a randomized trial does for you that you can't do without a randomized trial? Let me give you one example. I'm in Trinidad right now because there's going to be close to 450, 500 murders this year in a population of 1.2 million people. My suspicion is that's probably more murders than the entire state of Oregon is going to have in the course of a year. Certainly the murder rate of 40 per 100,000 or higher is going to be higher than it's going to be in Oregon. And so what are they doing about it? Well, we've been working on this for 2 years now almost, and we developed a randomized controlled trial across 40 police districts, all of which had high homicide rates. For 3 months last fall, we implemented random assignment in 20 out of the 40 high homicide police districts of a program that we had some reason to believe would work, but we didn't know whether it would work in this particular context, and we didn't know if it would work specifically on homicides and shootings, attempted homicides. That program is built on lots of prior evidence. We could have just designed the program and rolled it out, but nobody would have believed it. They would have said, well, you're reducing the homicide in some places, it's just pushing the homicides around to other places. And in fact, what we found was that the program was extremely effective, but because it was only being used in a pilot area, at the same time we were producing 40% reductions in homicides and shootings in the 20 target districts. The overall homicide rate was going up. Now, if we just tried the program in those districts, we might have seen the homicide going down, but it wouldn't have been convincing. It wouldn't have told people what they wanted to know, which was what should be the national program. And as a result of that randomized trial, we are now implementing the national program. And surprise, surprise, some of the districts are doing it with more integrity than others. We just went through the data today. In 7 of the police districts, they're hitting the target of 3 15-minute visits to the homicide hotspots by patrol cars every day. And in those 7 districts, the homicide rate's down 20%. In the other 38 districts that are in the high homicide category now, they're not hitting the target, and their homicides are up 43%. And so the commissioner told all the commanders today, we have the clear evidence, you're just not doing the job. The program will work if you do it. We know that from the randomized controlled trial, and now we know from having implemented it in 7 districts correctly, and the program is working. And they're just going to have to go out and do it. He's ordering them all to go out on duty at night and make sure the hotspot patrols are being delivered. It's really an important choice for them because of all of the things they're doing. They're lowering their crime rate otherwise by about 23% this year, but the homicides are up. An election is coming up. The entire country is obsessed with murder. It's going to hurt their international tourist and other commerce activity. So for them, the randomized trial is an absolutely essential tool of solving the #1 problem in the whole country at the moment. Let me contrast that to something completely different that you may have heard about, and it's police wearing body-worn video cameras. This is an idea that was sort of popping up here and there, and nobody took it very seriously until we had a police chief from California come to study at Cambridge for his master's degree. And we were talking about the body-worn videos and how you might do a randomized trial in it. So he went back to this city outside of Los Angeles of about 120,000 people, and he randomly assigned every cop on patrol to have a body-worn video camera on half of all the shifts. And comparing the shifts where the cops were wearing the body-worn video cameras at no insubstantial expense, I might point out. It was quite an investment to get the cameras. But he was willing to do it because he was convinced that he could do a good test and find out one way or the other. So Tony Farrar, this chief, went a whole year with all the police in his force signed up to the idea of wearing these cameras on some shifts and not others. And what the research evidence showed was that they reduced the use of force in citizen encounters by 60% when their cameras were on compared to when they weren't. And overall, the complaints against the police dropped by 90%. Now, it was almost too good to be true, but it got picked up in a federal court decision against the New York City Police Department last August, where the judge ordered the police in the highest stop and search precincts in New York to wear the body-worn video cameras at all times. He was immediately seized on in London because the cause of the 2011 riots had been a shooting in which the police said that the guy pointed a gun at them, and witnesses disputed it. Had the police been wearing a camera at the time, there's a good chance it would have demonstrated that the decedent who they shot to death was pointing a gun at them at the time. We've had now a number of police who've been charged with murder and have been acquitted based on the fact that they were wearing the body-worn video. But, you know, despite all of this good reason from this one small randomized trial with 120 cops in a suburban town in California, there are now 20 police departments around the world joining together to do their own randomized controlled trials because they want to know exactly what benefit they get in their own communities, whether it works for them, and before they go out and spend a fortune on not only buying but also maintaining and operating these very expensive body-worn video systems, they want to know what the profit is, what the return on investment is, not just in relation now to complaints against the police or to use of force, but the big issue in England is domestic violence. And whether if the police are wearing the video when they go into a domestic violence call and they can take the statements on the cameras from everybody at the scene, which they might later not want to make, but once they're down on video, they are increasingly admissible in court. So now the question is, can you get better effects of policing domestic violence by having the police wear the cameras? And that's one of the many questions these randomized controlled trials are going to answer for domestic violence. I could give you lots of other examples, but one of the things about the police is that they're very practical. They're much more skeptical about anybody claiming that a program works. And they have been embracing randomized controlled trials far more passionately than any other element of the criminal justice system. In the old days of therapeutic rehabilitation, there was a kind of psychological orientation. So in the 60s, there were a number of randomized controlled trials of offender rehabilitation programs. There haven't.
Sounds like I fell down a well.
Yeah.
Dr. Sherman, are you still there? Do we?
Hello.
Oh,
Can you hear me
yep,
now?
we can.
Okay, good. We just had some interference. I was going to say that I think the police are always under a lot of pressure to solve problems and to do a better job. And they may not have as much luxury as other branches of government to just say, well, we're going to do the same thing we always do. So they're always looking for new solutions. And their view is increasingly going to be, if we don't have a randomized trial to show that it's worthwhile putting police in schools or having a DARE program or all the other things we get asked to spend money on, we're going to take the position that if there's no evidence that this program works, we're not going to do it. And that's what we call evidence-based policing. We do the things that we have evidence are producing a return on investment for the taxpayer's dollar or pound or whatever it is in whatever country, because now there's this nationally based organization in England called the Society for Evidence-Based Policing. It's got people from 34 countries, and they're all committed. They're all mostly police officers who are doing their own randomized experiments because they see that's the way to do policing, just like it's the way to do medicine. And in medicine, since the first randomized trial was done in 1948, testing a cure for tuberculosis, there's an estimated 1 million randomized trials that are put together and help us decide what is cost-effective in terms of medicine and what isn't cost-effective in terms of medicine. That's kind of the model not only for policing, but for education and for social services and many other areas. And if anybody thinks it's a waste of money to spend money on randomized trials, then they might say it's a waste of money to have auditors find out whether the company is making a profit or suffering a loss. It's a waste of money to to file the statements with the Security and Exchange Commission, where they have to certify this information. I think it's just inconceivable, if we want to use a business model for government, that we think we can deliver all of this expensive stuff without having any clear way of estimating the cause and effect relationship between spending the government's money and getting a benefit for the public. I couldn't be more passionate about the need to get government into the 21st century and to have a clear outcomes-based assessment of what to spend money on and what not to spend money on. I'm convinced that if we would stop wasting so much money on programs that are untested, and that eventually when they do get tested, like the DARE program, they're found to have no benefit in relation to a huge amount of cost. If we could be putting that money into things that do work, such as hotspots policing, we could be getting a lot less serious crime in our communities, possibly for even less money than we're spending at the present time. And any area of government you want to give me, I was director of the Fels Institute of Government for 6 years at the University of Pennsylvania, which used to train more city managers than any other university in the country. Any area of government you want to give me, I can give you examples of how randomized controlled trials have helped to save money and have helped to get a better outcome for the communities in which these programs are administered. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, and even to make a particular point about policing, but I don't think it's quite as important to talk about the specific outcome measures for crime as it is to make this general point about anything across government. But if you'd like to talk about crime in more detail, I'd be happy to do that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Questions? Mr. Gardner.
Dr. Sherman, first, I apologize for inverting your name. I had a senior moment. But I guess in this, your audience recognizes the importance of having evidence-based programs. And so the complaint that we hear most often is that randomized controlled trials are too expensive and that there are other essentially equivalent means of validating program efficacy, like meta-analysis, and that if we choose randomized controlled trials over the meta-analysis type alternative, we're essentially depriving many people of services that we might otherwise be able to deliver. And if you could address that in the context of treatment and supervision and incarceration programs, that would be especially helpful.
Well, I'm very glad to have that question because I think there's a mistaken premise in that argument that you're citing. When you do a meta-analysis, and meta-analysis is absolutely central in medicine for figuring out what works and what doesn't, what you're analyzing is a lot of studies together. That's what the meta is. It's sort of beyond the analysis of one study, and it's the analysis of all the studies put together. The only meta-analyses that statisticians accept are those in which the studies being analyzed are randomized controlled trials. And so the point is that there's no free lunch. You can't get away from the question of how do we know what works. The only way we can know that is to do a randomized trial, or in effect to assume that what has worked in another country or in another state or in very different kinds of communities is going to work here in Oregon just because it's cheaper to make that assumption that a study that's been done in Nashville, Tennessee, or in Denver, Colorado, or in Trinidad is going to work the same way in Oregon. What we know from doing these randomized trials in different places, and what they know from doing randomized trials in medicine in different places, is that you can get very different results in different communities. You can get different results with different kinds of populations, with different risk factors at stake. And especially in crime, especially in criminal justice policy choices, the potential to have something work very well with some kinds of people and very badly with other kinds of people is now well established. One thing we found with 4 different randomized controlled trials in using arrest for domestic violence is that arrest works very well in communities with pretty low unemployment rates, comparing cities. But if you go into cities with very high unemployment rates, the effect of arrest for domestic violence, if it's not injurious, people aren't going to the hospital, the sort of punch and slap kind of thing, what you're doing is you're doubling or tripling the rate of domestic violence with arrest, as opposed to a warning, which is actually sufficient to reduce repeat calls and does so much better than making the arrest. Now we have a long-term follow-up in Milwaukee with a concentrated poverty area where we did a randomized trial and arrest 23 years ago. And what we found is that the victims whose partners were arrested are actually more likely to die, as Time Magazine and other international newspapers reported with our study in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. Why are they dying? Possibly because they found the effect of their partner being arrested for a shoving match and being taken away in handcuffs in front of the neighbors was so shameful that it was a stress factor for them that later led to premature death from heart attacks, and that it was one of the reasons of death, but not from homicide. So you learn things that are surprising when you do randomized trials, and you can follow them up over a long period of time. You get beyond the sort of short-term benefit and really ask, how does the criminal justice system affect people's lives? And do we have collateral damage of the kind that we found in Milwaukee? We're now trying to replicate that in Charlotte, which also had a very high unemployment rate. And the striking thing about Milwaukee is that it was actually the employed victims, the women who were working in a neighborhood where most women were on welfare, who were the ones who suffered the highest rates of death if their partners were randomly assigned to an arrest compared to not. So that was a good example of an expensive study. But let me just make it clear that Tony Farrar did his study in Rialto, California, as the chief of police without spending a penny on anything except his enrolling in the master's degree program at Cambridge University. And we gave him advice on how to do his study like we'd supervise any other master's thesis. He was able to use the very strong capacity of a small police department with 120 people that knows how to use computers, and they compiled the information that they needed to do the randomized trial. We've got 15 randomized trials going on across England right now. Every one of them is being done as part of the regular budget of the police department. Only Hampshire has a dedicated analyst for the experiment they're doing in domestic violence, which has found a 46% reduction in repeat offenses in relation to taking these guys to a batterer's counseling session that works pre-trial in a much better way than any of these post-sentencing experiments have found. But that's basically cost them about $30,000 to do, as opposed to the Milwaukee domestic violence experiment, which was a big deal, in part because they weren't familiar with how to do experiments. And so in the early days, you did see $1 million, $500,000 experiments. And for many kinds of experiments where you need detailed measurement, it can be very expensive. I would argue it's worth it. But if you never spent another penny of state money or federal money on randomized trials, but you provided a consulting service that would help agencies to construct their own randomized trials with their own budgets, that would, the small cost of having an agency that can help to set up the randomized trials, which is exactly what the Prime Minister's office has done in England, and found better ways to collect fines, for example, that helps to fund the court system, which they spent a small amount of money on randomized trials, and the return on investment has just been huge. So I think it's very short-sighted to say, first of all, that you can get what you need from meta-analysis, which you really can't do if you want to know exactly how well the program is going to work in Oregon or in Portland versus Eugene or what have you. And secondly, it's very short-sighted to say that even the investment that it takes to do randomized trials is big, because it doesn't have to be. It can be almost negligible in a government budget of $50 million or $100 million a year if somebody's spending $20,000 or even $50,000 on running a series of randomized trials to find out how not to waste $50 million. Again, it's much less than the cost of, say, an auditing company, PricewaterhouseCoopers, coming in and certifying the finances of a company as a proportion of all their revenues. It would be even less to finance these low-cost randomized trials. And they're easier to do now in policing because so many police understand the logic. They know what's required to do a good trial. The more common these things become, it's just like computers. The costs are dropping all the time. And if we promote more randomized trials, you're going to be able to get more of them at lower cost and to save more government money. That's the key point.
Dr. Sherman, this is Jennifer Williamson. I'm a state representative from Portland, and I have a question for you. I have a couple of questions. The goal of this committee is to build a grant review process to fund innovative programs that reduce recidivism and victimization that will result in taking money out of the Department of Corrections because they won't need as many prison beds and invest it in the community. So one of our challenges is how do we use this money to encourage innovation, so new programs or new types of programs, and how do we make sure that we're addressing the needs of small rural communities? And so I'm wondering if you can address at what point would requiring a random control trial in a new program, how do you manage that, and how do you manage a random control trial requirement in a small community that may not have a large number of offenders that they're working with or victims that they're working with?
Let me take the second question first because, in a way, it's much easier. There is an issue in statistics called statistical power. Most people may have heard something about how you have to have a large enough sample size to be able to tell what's really going on. And that's associated with this thing called statistical power. Basically, if you are going to make a comparison between using a program and not using a program, you have to have enough cases to make sure that the difference you're seeing is not just due to chance, it's not just random noise. So if you have a small community that, say, may have, in the course of a year, they might have 50 victims of a certain kind of crime. It could take you at least 2 years to get 50 victims into one category and 50 into another. And if the difference isn't very big, you might need 4 or 5 years. But the way around that is to have people to get into partnership with 2 or 3 other communities in the state that have similar numbers, and they just try to come to terms to agree to have what's called a multi-site trial. And when you have a multi-site trial, you can do things faster, and you can do them for just as inexpensively, in a way, as you can by doing them one after another, or each one's doing their own. It's much more efficient to try to get them to partner. And I think if you write your legislation around the goal of not only funding a program, but funding the advancement of knowledge of what works in Oregon, then you will be able to see the communities come together. I think they will respond to the incentives to create that kind of collaboration. 3 district attorneys, for example, 3 different counties. Might not be too difficult. I don't know how many counties you have in Oregon, but I suspect it's a lot more than 3. And
yes.
So you've got a pretty good chance of getting partnerships of 3 or even 4 or 5 communities or counties to come together. The first part of your question, though, which is, excuse me, when do you require a randomized trial? I'm in favor of brainstorming, of innovations, of new ideas. And I think it's very important to encourage people to invent new approaches. A good example was all the fights after the pubs closed in Dorset, England, where the people would be waiting in line at the fish and chip shops after drinking for 4 hours. The pubs closed at 11 o'clock. Their blood sugar's low, and they're waiting for their fish and chips, so they start having fights. Well, some policeman had the idea of passing out chocolate in those lines. And he said when he passed out chocolate, the fights went down. Well, it was a great idea. It got in the press. But the problem is we don't know if it's true. We don't know whether it was just because the cop was there. We didn't do a control test to see whether, in fact, you should have a policy of trying to hand out chocolates after the pubs closed. It's almost a silly example, but it's a good example because it was a good idea. And had the police officer actually compiled some statistics on how many pub fights he had on nights when he was handing out the chocolates compared to when he hadn't, if there was some reason to have a grant for that, and that's a good example of a program I don't think you want to fund, but if you wanted to know whether it worked, you might want to fund a randomized trial so that if you can reduce the kind of fights that result in serious injury with any kind of program, no matter what it is. And let me give you a better example. It might be this domestic violence program that we're getting good results on in Hampshire, where the offender agrees to attend 2 Saturday morning workshops lasting 3 hours with other people who've been arrested for domestic violence and who also agreed to do this instead of being prosecuted. And so we're now up to about 200 cases which have been asked if they wanted, actually they were randomly assigned, and so half of them were asked if they wanted to come to the workshops. Every one of them agreed, and so far we have a lot less repeat offenses in the group that went to the workshops than the group that didn't. So if somebody writes in for a grant, say, we have this great idea for a workshop. You can give them the money for the workshops, and you won't know what the effect is because you won't have anything to compare it to. They might compare it to the citizen rates from the year before, but the economy might have changed, other measurement factors might have changed. You can never be sure if you do a before-after study because everything's changing all the time. But if you have a controlled comparison at the same point in time, and you're using random assignment, you can be sure. So I would say if somebody has run 1 or 2 workshops and they think they're getting good results, then they can apply for a grant to fund the workshops, but because there wouldn't be enough funding for all the cases, you'd have a good ethical basis to say, well, let's use effectively a lottery method to decide who would get it and who won't. And the benefit of that is we'll find out whether it makes sense for a district attorney to spend money on fighting domestic violence by using workshops rather than using prosecution. So maybe that's a much better example than something like chocolate to show how there would be a cost. You know what the cost of these workshops is in Southampton in England, the big port city where there's a lot of domestic violence going on. They're paying about $150 per case to go to these 2 workshops. And it's a group that is doing this on a charitable basis. But these workshops are paying for themselves in terms of reduced police calls for service going back to the same locations. And I think that's a good reason to invest in the randomized trial, even though it wouldn't cost very much. In fact, I don't think you need a university necessarily. If you have a trials center,
Dr. Sherman?
Sorry?
Oh.
Oh, you cut out again just real briefly.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Dr. Sherman, this is Craig Prinz. I'm the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Commission that will be making these grants. I wanted to follow up on your examples of the chocolates handed out by the police officer. I'm very familiar and actually with your work from the preventing crime, what works, what doesn't, what's promising, and the Maryland scale. What do you think about this? I would prefer to make the initial investment based upon some of that type of analysis of what has worked in other places based upon, let's say, what in your Maryland scale from 1997 would have been a 4 or a 5, and then committing to doing the outcome, the long-term random control trials, once we get some things out there and get the investments made. But I don't want to make the initial investment without any kind of guidance from the type of work you did in 1997. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable position to take, that the development of new
Dr. Sherman, you cut out again.
knowledge that can be shared around the country. I think the danger of that is that you can choke off innovation.
Right.
That one didn't sound good.
Yeah.
That one, I heard that one
sounded
before.
more fun.
Yeah,
No, you didn't hear it after
unless that was the chief.
Geez, Craig.
We were saying with the murder rate in Trinidad, I hope it's okay.
Well, I want to ask about pushing homicides. Hopefully we didn't push one over to this building.
Right.
Chief Sherman, or sorry, Chief Roberts, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, so we didn't lose you.
Dr. Sherman?
Crickets.
Okay.
He sounds like he's there.
Yeah.
Dr. Sherman, can you hear me?
Dr. Sherman, are you okay?
Go to Trinidad and see, make sure he's okay.
I'll be glad to,
We need
as long as I don't get killed there.
We can't hear him.
Dr. Sherman, it's Craig again here in Oregon. We can't hear you, but so if you can hear us, just maybe try one more time, and if not, we just thank you for your comments, and as someone who's familiar with your work, it was really appreciate you calling in.
I think we have his phone number. We can try to call him and see.
Did you have a question?
Well, I'll ask the question.
Hello, this is Lawrence Sherman. I've called back on a
Yeah.
landline, so I won't
Excellent.
drop out again.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. So, you know, I had, I think what I'm struggling with is when we target these initial investments, like I said, I would like to use something, you know, some of the evaluations that you collected in your, you know, that type of rigorous evaluations. They wouldn't all be RCTs, of course, because a lot of them would be quasi-experimental designs, but something that has good, you know, internal validity. I would much rather have that type of work guide where we invest and then commit to doing RCTs. And I like your idea of multi-site RCTs. So I just wanted, I didn't hear your comment back. I hope what I heard is, I think you said it might be a reasonable idea, and then it kind of, we clicked off.
Sorry about that.
That's
Okay, the reason it's a reasonable idea is that you start from the position that what you're funding with the taxpayers' money in Oregon already has evidence behind it, which is better than having no evidence at all. And if you can then encourage them to produce Oregon-specific evidence at the same time that you're funding a program that already has evidence from other places, you're both doing due diligence for the taxpayer in spending the money in the first place and further protecting the taxpayer by ensuring that it's not something that worked one other place but it doesn't work in Oregon. And so to actually insist on a randomized trial design wherever possible is something that legislatures can do that just overwhelms the massive cultural opposition in criminal justice cultures to ever choosing to do something based on chance as opposed to based on their good judgment, their experience, all of the things that they think they know about their job, the way investors think they know about how to pick stocks. And as Daniel Kahneman has shown, most stock investors can't do any better than random chance anyway. And I'm afraid that most criminal justice decision makers may not do better than certainly statistical prediction about what is going to work in some context than others. You have a famous judge in Oregon who's in favor of evidence-based sentencing for that reason, Judge Marcus. And so that's what it comes back to. I think your idea is a good one, that you wouldn't fund your grants for programs that don't have some evidence, even if it's not published, but to have a good research design even at level 3 or level 4. Level 5, of course, is a randomized trial, and you could have this double insurance. You could say, first, you must have prior evidence. Second, do this program in a way that offers a randomized comparison to not doing it with similar kinds of people or neighborhoods or however the program is supposed to work, and have some capacity to vet that at the state level in terms of what's an adequate research design, rather than trying to deal with all of those tough issues in legislation, which I think are probably too complicated to write into law, except that you'd have a regulatory review by
or technical assistance provided by a department at the state level that would certify it's a strong research design.
Yeah.
It's an appropriate, with statistical power, appropriate randomized trial that will produce a good profit and loss statement for the taxpayer. So you can do all that. The one downside is if there's no evidence at all, then you're not going to be investing in good new ideas. But I think you could say that that's the way you've decided to protect the taxpayers' money. If they can compile some evidence on their own, then you'll invest in it if they'll advance the evidence with a randomized trial. The more I answer your question in a long-winded way, the more I think actually you've got a really good idea if you can do it as I suggest.
Dr. Sherman, we the reason I really appreciate that your comments, and we really have looked at the work that I think you started in '97 with the Maryland scale. I think Washington State Institute of Public Policy, just to our north, has worked with that to make sure they're developing a meta-analysis of good, rigorous studies. And that's exactly my point of having something to target these grants at. And then we in Oregon have done, so I also administer the Edward Byrne grant. And so we did design and implement a multi-site random controlled trial of drug courts in 4 counties. So we have some experience with doing RCTs, and I think we would like to continue that. The thing that I wanted to make clear to folks is, in our experience, it was about 5 years from design to outcomes for the random controlled trial. And I think I looked on, while you were talking about the body cameras in Devon and Cornwall, that study looked like it spanned about 5 years from 2006 to 2011. And
so that wasn't a randomized trial, though.
Okay, that wasn't a randomized trial.
No, the body-worn video experiment, the randomized trial that was cited by the federal judge in New York, was done in the course of 1 year in Rialto, California.
Okay.
And that was 2012 to 2013, and it was finished in early 2013, and by August it was reported in the New York Times right after it was finished in early 2013, and then got picked up in the federal decision in August of 2013. So within 15 months of the trial being launched, it was having a major influence on public policy around the world.
Okay, that's helpful, because in our experience, it takes, we took about 5 years with our drug court evaluation, and I want folks here to have a reasonable expectation of when we would have it. But I think we've shown a commitment to doing this in a criminal justice system, and I just want to be careful about thinking about the time it will take, and make sure that we have the commitment to see it through.
Yeah, let me say just 2 quick things. One is that setting up drug courts is a major institutional restructuring. It's like constitutional change almost. And it is by definition then much more complicated to evaluate new structures than it is to evaluate changes in practice within existing structures. And so that's why we can do this experiment so quickly in Hampshire with the workshops, if the prosecutors who had promised to let us have a lot more cases had kept their promise. It's a different prosecution system in the UK. It's not elected district attorneys, so I don't want to make any comparisons. I'm just saying that if we had been able to do what they agreed to within 1 year, we would have had a very clear answer, and we'd be rolling out this project all across Hampshire and probably all across England, or at least further randomized trials across England. They're now likely to happen anyway based on about the first 18 months. But other programs, especially, this is where the trade-off comes. If you can get more cities or more counties to participate, you can go very quickly, and you don't need 5 years by any means to get a good answer about whether there's a cost effectiveness within a 2-year follow-up period. That's the standard that has been recommended by the Coalition for Evidence-Based Practice in Washington and some National Academy of Science reports, if it's involving individuals. If it's a program like Hotspots Policing, there is no follow-up period. It works on a day-to-day basis. And we know that when the hotspots policing is concentrated, it's working better. There's less crime, and when they don't deliver it, then the crime goes up. I don't know that you'd even fund a grant for doing something like hotspots policing, but you might fund a grant for doing other things that are about community practice and not about individual change. And with community practice, it's either crime going down while you do it, or it doesn't go down, and you can find out immediately whether you're getting that return on investment. I would say that a lot of these things can be done in less than 1 year if they're high volume, and that also increases your chance of getting a good return on investment. So to a certain extent, it structures the kind of ideas you get, but it may make them a lot more practical and may make them much more focused on doing things that not only sound like a good idea, but have good prior evidence. And there's a lot of cases like this. We're spending a lot of money on it already. We can find out pretty quickly whether this is a way to get more for that money or to spend even less money.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. My name is Kiki, and I'm with the Community Corrections Association. I just want to make sure I understand. So as we're talking about the programs that we would ultimately be referring offenders to, in the randomized controlled study, we would be referring some offenders to a program and then choosing offenders that would not be engaging in any services at all. Is that correct?
No, not necessarily. You can always compare two different kinds of services. You can compare, for example, one way of doing it that is pretty common right now and it's very expensive, and you can get another way that might work as well and it's less expensive. And if you find out that doing the less expensive thing gets exactly the same result, then you can save money, possibly doing it with more people and benefiting the community with a lower crime rate. A good example for offenders that we're working on in the UK is voluntary wearing of electronic tags for people who are coming out of prison. If they can get out of prison early by doing that, they have an incentive to do it. In Sweden, there's some evidence in the Journal of Experimental Criminology that those offenders who make a transition into the community by wearing a tag can cut off their ties to their bad influence friends more effectively by saying, I can't go out with you tonight because I got to stay home with my tag. And so they just get in the habit of living in the community but away from their friends, and it helps them have a lower recidivism rate. There's a number of ways to do that program. You could make the offenders pay for it themselves, which they might be willing to do if they can get out of prison and go back to work. Drunk driving cases might be done that way. There's another idea out around domestic violence and drunk driving, which is these sobriety tags. And a lot of discussion about that in England now. American Journal of Public Health published a RAND Corporation evaluation of that from South Dakota 2 years ago. And I think there's every indication that if you were to even just run a list of promising programs as part of your grants effort to get people to propose something like a randomized trial of sobriety tags that's never been done. And they're showing with a level 2 study in the Maryland scale in South Dakota a reduction in domestic violence from giving sobriety tags to drunk drivers, as well as a reduction in drunk driving recidivism. So it's like crying out for a randomized trial to see if we can reduce domestic violence for anybody who's been arrested for a case of domestic violence. And here again, if the prosecutor agrees that this case should be diverted with the prosecution decision deferred if they cooperate with sobriety tags, and then you see that sobriety tags can reduce domestic violence, that's a good way, I think, to compare two different things. One is prosecution, which is the standard approach, and another is sobriety tags, which might work a whole lot better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator?
Thank you. Dr. Sherman, I just want to follow up on your presentation. You made a statement regarding something to the effect about pushing homicides to another area. Then you followed up that by police doing what I'm going to call drive-bys, where they made themselves, I guess, visible in these quote-unquote hot homicide areas, that it reduced, I guess, homicides in those areas. And it would seem to me that that in itself may be the pushing it out, that you may limit something happening by having a visual presence
but wouldn't you still have these, I'm assuming a lot of this is around drug transactions, turf wars, and people just moving to other areas?
Yes, actually, what I was trying to say about our experiment in Trinidad is that we got around that because it was the first experiment in which we didn't randomly assign one hotspot to have more policing and other hotspots not to. That's how I did it 20 years ago in Minneapolis with David Weisberg. And all the other hotspots experiments since then, about 30 of them, have done it hotspot by hotspot, with this idea of displacement actually being disproven most of the time. When people measure it, they don't find any evidence of displacement. But in Trinidad, what we did was to take entire police districts with 10, 15, 20 hotspots. And we said every hotspot in this district is going to get extra police patrols. And if the offenders don't want to go to those places where the police are putting in a lot more patrol, they're going to have to leave the entire district, which means they're going to have to go much further. They're going to run into other people's turf. They might get killed by other criminals if they go out of the district. And we have no evidence of displacement in what we did in Trinidad. And we are not doing that in a way that is costing the Trinidad Police Service money for the research. We're just making it part of the training, that we're teaching them how to do their own randomized trials in a way that builds on their crime analysis capacity to evaluate the impact by simply looking at the crime records they're already keeping.
Right,
and so this is, I think, a good example of how a low-cost approach can produce very valuable information that can ultimately save lives.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, can I ask one more question? I just want to follow up with my prior question. So you're saying that in order for some of these services to work or to get engagers to get offenders to engage in services, we need some sort of incentive attached to that? Is that what I hear you say?
Not necessarily. One of the key factors in any experiment involving individual people as opposed to neighborhoods or areas is to have what you call the pipeline of cases come through and not to be turned off by eligibility requirements or offenders not being interested in doing it, for example. A lot of individual experiments run afoul of the fact that the people in charge of the cases don't really want to cooperate with the experiments. So that can be a problem, but incentives are one way to encourage offenders to volunteer for programs that you might not be able to impose without their consent. And there's a lot of programs that are in that category. But in a way, the incentive is really for the criminal justice system to conserve its resources for the most serious cases and to save money by allowing people to have deferred prosecution for relatively minor offenses that are high volume in nature, and to see if the system can save money by having them do something else that they're willing to agree to in exchange for not having immediate prosecution, but still having that sword of Damocles hanging over their head. So I'm not sure that the sword of Damocles is really an incentive as much as a kind of win-win context for doing that kind of experiment. And I certainly wouldn't be paying offenders to come into programs, although we do sometimes pay victims if we want to interview them on their experience with being re-victimized, as we did with domestic violence cases. I think you can do this really without cash incentives or without giving up anything of value that's known, because we don't know what the value of prosecution is compared to some of these diversion programs. And by and large, a lot of the diversion programs turn out to be more effective than prosecution because something happens with them, whereas prosecution often runs afoul of evidentiary problems and the case is dismissed, and ultimately nothing happens. So I think there's every reason to be funding community corrections programs, not on a post-conviction basis, but on a post-arrest, pre-charge basis. If you can collaborate with district attorneys to identify areas where they think they're spending a lot of money and not getting much for it for the taxpayer, but where they could try alternatives that would defer prosecution that could work much more cost effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gardner.
Professor Sherman, I know that we're very short on time, so this is my last one. Suppose there are sort of level 2 and 3 science suggestions that a particular program has therapeutic value for offenders, and we want to do a randomized control trial of such a program in Oregon. Many of the people in our system will say that that's unethical because we're essentially depriving half of our offender population of a treatment that we believe is therapeutic. So how do we process that?
Well, I think one position is that there are more programs for any given type of offender that have evidence in support of them than any one program. And so if what you do is invest in one program that has evidence but may cost more, even if the evidence is that it's more effective, you can compare it to another program that may cost less, that has some evidence of effectiveness, and you can find out whether for the kind of offenders you have in Oregon, that by doing something with both the experimentally assigned groups, you wouldn't even call one of them a control group. You just call it Group A versus Group B. And Group A happens to cost more than Group B, so if you combine the cost and the result and you find out where you're getting a better return on investment, that's going to be the basis. There's nothing unethical in randomly assigning 2 programs that have previous evidence of effectiveness. And there's plenty of programs that you could be testing in that way to find out whether they work better in Oregon than what you're doing at the moment. And if you have no program for a lot of these people, you can actually justify the fact that until there's good evidence, you won't spend the money. So you could say, well, let's have 3 categories. Let's have the current status quo, which is no program, and then a medium cost program and a higher cost program, and see whether either of these 2 programs do better than the status quo. And if they do, as the Federal Judicial Center of the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Office of Administrative Office of the Courts, 1981, they said it's unethical not to do a randomized trial because you won't know, A, whether you're doing harm, or B, whether failure to provide the program is going to do harm. Either way, you need to know, and the only way you can find out is the randomized trial, and that's why their report on experimentation in the law says the ethical obligation is to do the research, not to avoid it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Sherman, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. That was very helpful conversation for us to have, and your expertise will help to inform what this committee does in creating our rules for our Justice Reinvestment Program. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation, and best of luck to your progress at advancing our knowledge.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
So next steps.
Next steps will be for everyone to reach out to me with comments. I'll try to put everything together and get them back out to the committee, and then we will be, CJC, Angela Albee and myself will be reaching out to you to pick the next date that we get together. I'm thinking early September.
Excellent.
Not August.
All right, well, thank you all. Thank you, Chief, for being on the phone. Right.
Thank you.
With that, we are adjourned.